Why is a city presented as the showcase of West Africa so deeply divided? Abidjan does not resemble any other metropolis in the sub-region. Nothing brings it closer to Ouagadougou, Bamako, or Niamey. Abidjan looks toward the ocean. It looks neither toward the desert nor toward the inland territories. It stretches between lagoon and sea. It is open, connected, plugged into the world. Here, everything circulates: goods, capital, ambitions. The economic capital of Côte d'Ivoire, it concentrates nearly 80% of national activity and more than 20% of the population. Among its economic actors, the Lebanese community, although a minority, around 80,000 people, holds nearly 40% of the Ivorian economy. According to the Lebanese Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Côte d'Ivoire, it owns a large share of the private real estate stock in Abidjan, controls 60% of trade, 90% of retail, and 60% of industry, contributes to more than 15% of the country's tax revenues, and generates more than 300,000 direct and indirect jobs. It has shaped entire districts such as Marcory, Riviera, Yopougon, Adjamé, or Treichville, and financed hotels, shopping centers, and high-end villas. Its port is one of the most powerful on the continent. Its airport welcomed nearly 2 million passengers in 2021. Bridges, interchanges, urban highways. The city moves forward through concrete and cranes. The country shows an average growth of 6.7%. Yet, 37.1% of the population still lives in poverty. According to the Prosperity Index, Côte d'Ivoire is the country that has progressed the most in the world between 2011 and 2021. And this is where the contradiction appears, because Abidjan is a fractured city. Behind the spectacular bridges, reality is different depending on the district where one lives. In the morning, an executive crosses the Charles de Gaulle Bridge in an air-conditioned car. A few kilometers away, a vendor leaves Yopougon before dawn, crammed into a gabaka. Same city, two experiences, two speeds. This is not an accident. This is not new. Abidjan was not first designed for those who would live in it. It was designed to shine, an ambition inherited from the colonial period, extended after independence, and still visible today. Despite its status as a regional locomotive, the city struggles to offer a decent living environment to a large part of its population.
Il n'y a pas l'eau à l'ancienne gendarmerie. Nous sommes fatigués. Surtout moi, les carèmes là même.
So, how did we get here? How can a city so strategic, rich, and connected produce so many inequalities? What you are about to hear is at once historical, urban, and deeply political. Welcome to We Emerge, the best place to get inspired and make a difference. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can do so by clicking the subscribe button. Let's get started. The history of Abidjan begins with a flight. Long before the arrival of European settlers and the official creation of the city at the beginning of the 20th century, the plateau site was already inhabited. The Abidjans, an Ebri people living mainly from fishing, occupy this peninsula surrounded by the Ebri Lagoon. Around them, a constellation of villages structured the space. Lolrojoro, near Banco Bay, Cocody on the eastern shore, Anoumabo on Petit Bassam Island, as well as Agban and Adjamé further north. A world organized around water. Canoes, lagoon exchanges. Nothing foreshadowed the sprawling metropolis to come. At the end of the 19th century, everything changed. Grand-Bassam, the first capital of Côte d'Ivoire, located about 40 kilometers to the east, was struck by severe yellow fever epidemics, notably in 1896. The disease decimated the European population. The colonial administration was paralyzed. The city became practically uninhabitable. It had to be abandoned. A more sanitary site had to be found urgently, safer, more controllable. From the outset, the choice of a new center of power followed a sanitary and administrative logic, not an urban project designed for its inhabitants. Abidjan was not born from a social or inclusive vision. It emerged as a fallback solution, a response to the fear of disease, a way to protect the colonial apparatus. In 1898, the Houdaille mission was sent to study the creation of a lagoon port and a new route of penetration toward the interior of the country. In 1900, the capital was temporarily transferred to Bingerville, created following an agreement between the customary authorities of the Acquais Canton and the French colonial administration. The city was named in honor of Louis-Gustave Binger, the colony's first governor. But Bingerville was only a temporary solution, too remote, too limited, unable to support the colony's economic ambitions. The capital changed location, but the question remained where to establish a city capable of controlling the territory, exporting wealth, and connecting the interior of the country to the world. Abidjan was waiting for its moment. Discreet, lagoon-based, strategic. From its very origins, its destiny was not that of a refugee city. It was that of a tool, a city chosen not for what it is, but for what it enables. Very quickly, the colonial authorities realized that Bingerville was not enough. Governing was not enough. Goods had to be exported, transported, and flows had to be controlled. A capital without a port is incomplete. And in this regard, Abidjan imposed itself. Thanks to the work of the Houdaille mission, the administration's attention turned to the plateau, a peninsula rising about 30 meters above the Abidjan Lagoon, surrounded by the bays of Cocody and Banco. The site was strategic, easy to monitor, to organize, to defend, and connected to the future railway axis toward the north, open both to the interior of the country and to the Atlantic. This geographical choice sealed the city's destiny. Abidjan was not chosen to host a population, but to serve a logic of control. Its altitude was lower than that of Bingerville, but its location was decisive. The climate was considered healthier for Europeans, and above all, the geographical configuration facilitated the extension of the railway toward the north. The railway became the backbone of the project. Its terminus, close to the future Vridi Canal, transformed the Abidjan Peninsula into a strategic hub. For the first time, an efficient connection between production areas and the Atlantic became conceivable. Abidjan was structured around flows, goods, and economic interests, long before it was structured around its inhabitants. On November 28, 1920, Abidjan was elevated to the rank of capital. Less than 10 years later, its first urban plan was adopted. The objective was clear: to combine political power, maritime port, and industrial development. But the project was fragile. Between 1904 and 1907, the first attempts to dig the Vridi Canal failed. Hardly opened, the inlet was closed again by marine sands. Yet commercial interests were already moving forward. Companies such as CFAO settled in. The railway was operating, trade was flowing. The city progressed despite the obstacles. This progress came at a cost. As early as 1902, several Abidjan villages were displaced: Lolrojoro, Cocody, and Umabo. The expansion of Abidjan took place through displacement, erasure, and forced reconfiguration of space. The city expanded, but it was not built for everyone. In 1931, the Port-Bouet Wharf, intended to replace that of Grand-Bassam, reinforced the city's economic role. In 1934, Abidjan officially succeeded Bingerville as the administrative capital. In 1936, after studies conducted in Delft to avoid past mistakes, the construction of the Vridi Canal was awarded. The Second World War delayed the project once again. The works on the Vridi Canal, relaunched after studies in Delft, were completed in 1950. The deep water port came into service. The city changed scale. The figures confirmed the shift. In 1950, all Ivorian ports handled 608,000 tons of goods. 1 year later, the port of Abidjan alone exceeded 700,000 tons. 10 years after its opening, 1.7 million tons, and more than 4 million in 1967. The destiny was sealed. Abidjan became an economic machine, designed for export, growth, and regional dominance before being designed for its inhabitants. Abidjan explodes. 1,400 inhabitants in 1912, 17,500 in 1934, 65,000 in 1950, 180,000 in 1960, 950,000 in 1975, more than 3 million at the end of the 1990s. Today, Greater Abidjan exceeds 5 million inhabitants over more than 2,100 square kilometers. Growth outpaces planning capacities. Some municipalities illustrate this tension. Yopougon counts 1.57 million inhabitants in 2021 over 153 square kilometers, combining planned neighborhoods and precarious areas with only 8.8% non-Ivoirians compared to 22% on average at the city scale. Economic attractiveness acts like a magnet. First Ivorians, then men and women coming from Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, or Ghana. By the end of the 1970s, nearly 40% of the population is foreign. But this dynamic overwhelms infrastructure. With an annual growth estimated at 8%, some peripheral municipalities concentrate the most visible effects of this uncontrolled urbanization. In Anyama, the population rises from around 300,000 to more than 450,000 inhabitants in 3 years, driven by evictions from Adjamé, Yopougon, and Atekube. Narrow roads, saturated networks, expanding precarious neighborhoods. At the national level, the urbanization rate climbs from 39% in 1988 to 52.5% in 2021. Côte d'Ivoire becomes a country where cities grow faster than the state can plan. Abidjan attracts, but access to the city remains unequal. Space becomes scarce, expensive, sometimes inaccessible. The population grows faster than planned neighborhoods. The city fragments. The divide is not always visible on maps. It is lived daily. Abidjan has not only become an economic capital, it is the mirror of a rapid, sometimes unbalanced, strained urbanization that puts those who live in it to the test. Faced with the demographic explosion, the authorities sought early on to control space. As early as the 1920s, Abidjan was designed to impress residential districts for Europeans, planned areas for executives and workers, populous sectors pushed to the periphery. The logic was clear. Modernity had to be visible, but according to a strict social hierarchy. The plateau concentrated administrative power and major boulevards. Cocody, Marcari, Kumasi, and Adjamé Nord structured housing. The Badani Plan, 1948 to 1952, consolidated this organization and laid the foundations of an administrative and port metropolis. Planning progressed, but prioritized image over social balance. After independence, the same logic continued. The SETAP Plan, 1960, programs by SEMA and ARA, the 1974 Master Plan, the Greater Abidjan Project in 2000. Expansion spread to Yopougon, Abobo, the Riviera, the Deux Plateaux. Boulevards, bridges, lagoon waterfront, the city displayed its modernity. But this staging came at a cost. Neighborhoods deemed incompatible with the official image were destroyed or marginalized. Prestige took precedence over social mix. This logic of prestige and modernity was supported by private investors, including the Lebanese community, which today holds around 80% of the private real estate stock in Abidjan. Behind the facade, inequalities took root, and the contrast kept intensifying between the planned city and informal spaces. Abidjan is not just its spectacular bridges and boulevards. The official city, the one we are shown, coexists with another city, dense, popular, often informal. A city where people live with insufficient infrastructure. Between 1960 and 1979, nearly 70,000 affordable housing units were built by Sikoji and Sojifiha, structuring Yopougon, Abobo, Cocody, and the Deux Plateaux. But the supply remained insufficient and expensive. Access was strict. The majority had to find alternatives elsewhere. Even today, funding priorities reflect this logic. Within the framework of the 2026 to 2030 National Development Plan, 70.2% of expected investments come from the private sector. Capital flows to profitable areas, leaving low-income households to settle on precarious, flood-prone, or non-buildable land. Nearly 7 out of 10 inhabitants live outside formal channels. In Anyama, the informal sector structures everyday life, from local small trade to regional exchanges. The contrast is spatial and social. On one side, the planned and sought-after districts of Cocody, Riviera, the Plateau, or Marquerie, often shaped by private investors, notably Lebanese, are Abidjan's highlights. Wide avenues and real estate at 850,000 to 1,200,000 CFA francs per square meter. In Riviera 3, a duplex recently sold for 118 million CFA francs, up 24% in 4 years. On the other side, Yopougon, Abobo, or certain areas of Kumasi, limited access to services, degraded roads, vulnerable housing. In Gesco or Abobo, the price per square meter is around 150,000 CFA francs, still out of reach for households earning around the minimum wage of 75,000 CFA francs, where rent can absorb more than half of family income. The contrast is stark. In neighborhoods like Yaosehi in Yopougon, housing is built from salvaged materials. Density is high, sanitary infrastructure is scarce, and flood risks are elevated. The slightly sloped terrain makes the neighborhood vulnerable to landslides during the rainy season. In Sikobois, Doucouré, or Wasakara, the same contrast appears. Comfortable residential neighborhoods coexist with precarious areas, revealing inequality embedded in space. To try to regain control over land, in 2022, the state launched the delimitation of 189 villages in Greater Abidjan to better manage land. The goal is to clarify territories, limit uncontrolled occupation, and organize development. The state also resumed evictions. Precarious neighborhoods like Washington and Cocody were destroyed, with relocations toward Abobo, Biabou in the direction of Alapay. In Songon, social housing initially planned at 5 million CFA francs was resold for up to 15 million CFA francs. In 2024, 1,199 families were relocated to Gesco. In Borabana, nearly 28,000 people were displaced, according to Amnesty International. Aid of 250,000 CFA francs per household was announced, considered insufficient. Relocations were offered in Songon, more than 40 kilometers from the city center, far from the informal activities on which many families depend. But these belated measures struggled to correct long-standing imbalances. Abidjan is not just a city of contrasts. It is structured by inequality. Understanding this duality is understanding the true face of Côte d'Ivoire's economic capital. Abidjan is expanding rapidly. The city, originally built on approximately 422 square kilometers, now covers more than 2,100 square kilometers. This growth puts direct pressure on natural spaces. Banco National Park, established in 1929 and covering 3,474 hectares, is one of the last dense forest masses located in the heart of an African metropolis. Urbanization is advancing around it. In 2022, a wall of about 10 kilometers was built to limit intrusions and informal expansion. This wall reveals a deeper reality. In Abidjan, nature is no longer protected proactively. It is confined. Banco remains a vital lung for the city, but it also symbolizes reactive rather than preventive management. The Ebrié Lagoon, which stretches over 560 square kilometers, is suffocating under domestic and industrial waste, plastic pollution, and untreated sewage. According to the National Office for Sanitation and Drainage, about 60% of residents are not connected to the collective sanitation network. Sewage from the 40% who are connected to the national network is treated notably at the Kumasi station before being discharged into the sea. But urban growth still exceeds infrastructure capacity. Territorial expansion, demographic pressure, and sanitation deficits place forest and lagoon ecosystems under sustained stress. Since the start of the 2024 rainy season, floods have caused 35 deaths in Côte d'Ivoire, including 32 in Abidjan and 3 in Korhogo, already surpassing the total toll of 2023, 30 deaths. In Abidjan, 176 high-risk sites have been identified, with eviction operations affecting several thousand people in Gesco Bankawant, Yopougon, and Borabana, Atekou Bay. Compensation of 250,000 CFA francs per household has been announced, with a budget estimated at 700 million CFA francs. While floods particularly affect residential neighborhoods in the upscale commune of Côte, this is largely because urban planning rules are not respected. In Côte, where 205 millimeters of rain fell in 72 hours, the situation is worsened. Large villas and apartment buildings have been built on sanitation works or near drainage basins, reducing the capacity of infrastructure to evacuate water. Faced with repeated disasters and over 100 flood-related deaths in the past 5 years, authorities have announced the creation of a national commission dedicated to climate governance. The capital faces a dual challenge: protecting its natural environment and adapting its infrastructure to absorb the impacts of climate change and rapid urbanization. Getting around in Abidjan is a challenge. Traffic jams, endless waits, honking, transport absorbing up to 30% of income, and several hours a day. At the national level, congestion costs 4 to 5% of GDP, according to the World Bank. In response, the state invests roads, ring roads, interchanges, a fourth bridge. The Ivorian-Japanese Friendship Bridge, inaugurated in 2019, eases traffic for users from Marcory and Treichville. At the same time, public transport has improved. Sotra increased from 1,022 buses in 2011 to 2,050 in 2024, with 139 lines compared to 83 previously. Lagoon transport exceeds 12 million passengers in 2024, compared to 5.3 million in 2011. Yet mobility still relies heavily on the informal sector. Gabaka and Woro Woro dominate. Anarchic stations saturate roads and intersections. Officially, 322 stations are registered, but in reality, there are many more. Since 2024, 295 agents have tried to regulate their operations. The contrast is striking. Modern infrastructure on one side, daily improvisation on the other. Bridges improve flow on some axes, but they are not enough to make the city fully functional. Facing the limits of road solutions, the state is changing strategy. Line 1 of the Abidjan Metro, 37 kilometers long, is planned to connect Anyama to Félix Houphouët-Boigny Airport, with 540,000 passengers expected per day and a travel time reduced to 30 minutes. But the construction has already displaced about 13,400 households. A study published in 2025 in Nature estimates that nearly 10,000 informal workers could lose their income. Inaugurated on August 12, 2023, the Alassane Ouattara Bridge, 630 meters long, with a pylon over 100 meters high, connects Cocody to the plateau. Launched in 2019, it cost 113 billion CFA francs and is expected to carry between 30,000 and 50,000 vehicles per day. This momentum is part of a broader policy of major works. Renovation of the Félix Houphouët-Boigny Stadium, 40,000 seats, Ebimpe Stadium, development of a marina at Cocody Bay, and the construction of Tower F, initial budget of 250 billion CFA francs. The bridge works generated about 3,000 jobs, but strikes broke out in August 2023, demanding payment of 300,000 CFA francs per worker. On the Tower F site, some workers report receiving about 70,000 CFA francs every 2 weeks. These infrastructures are often presented as symbols of a second Ivorian miracle, in a context where inaugurations regularly coincide with electoral deadlines. Abidjan multiplies projects, including an east-west bus rapid transit line. But without integration of the informal sector and urban reorganization, these solutions risk remaining partial. Abidjan has projects, it has infrastructure, it has resources. But one question remains. Without urban reorganization and integration of the informal sector, will these solutions remain partial? In some corners of Abidjan, waste is part of the landscape. Not far from the famous Félix Houphouët-Boigny Stadium, nicknamed Le Félicia, renovated in 2020, the Ebrié Lagoon resembles a cesspool under heavy anthropic and urban pressure. In Abobo and Yopougon, along expressways, garbage clogs, gutters, and sidewalks. Trash bins exist, but are seldom used. Sewage on the roads, plastics in the canals, floods and disease follow. Residents protest. Sometimes they clean up themselves, but the next day, it all starts again. Incivility dominates, but it is not enough to explain the situation. These practices take place within a broader context: urban poverty, insufficient public services, and the pressure of the cost of living. In March 2025, a kilogram of local rice sold for 600 to 700 CFA francs, according to Anstat. For a household earning the minimum wage, the choice is simple. When feeding oneself becomes a priority, the environment takes a back seat. Municipalities try to act. In Abobo, 69 sanitation committees have been created. The state has planned fines and sanctions. On the ground, enforcement remains uneven. Uncleanliness thus becomes both a cause and a consequence of precarious living. It is not just a matter of garbage. It reveals a deeper urban imbalance. In March 2024, the Abidjan district announced the creation of a brigade of 295 officers drawn from the district police and the municipal police of the 13 communes. Its mission: to clear major arteries, free public and non-buildable spaces, enforce the prohibition of street vending, begging, handcarts, and open defecation. These operations have sometimes led to significant tensions. In 2024, some interventions targeting urban disorder even sparked accusations of violence and reignited criticism of the methods used. Ultimately, Abidjan's future depends on its ability to reconcile two cities that coexist without meeting. The metropolis is dynamic, ambitious, and powerful. The 2026 to 2030 National Development Plan allocates 114,838.5 billion CFA francs, approximately 175 billion euros, an unprecedented amount. The previous plan had already achieved an execution rate of 77.1% by the end of 2024. Private investors, including the Lebanese community, will continue to play a key role in the city's evolution. But the challenge remains to channel these investments into an inclusive city where infrastructure, housing, and services benefit everyone. Resources exist, inequalities persist. An emergency plan of 25,000 housing units, estimated at 500 billion CFA francs, has been launched to try to make up for the shortfall. The question is simple: can Abidjan become a metropolis that serves everyone, or will it remain a bright but fragile showcase? The challenge is not just to build more, but to strengthen the foundations: water, sanitation, waste management, housing, integration of informal neighborhoods. Prevent rather than cure. If nothing changes, Abidjan will not collapse suddenly. It will continue to move forward, but at two speeds. Abidjan is not in crisis. It is unbalanced, and a city can live with inequality for a long time, but never indefinitely.